Dan Chodorkoff, 75 years old, Marshfield, Vermont. I was born in Hackensack, New Jersey. I was raised in a middle-class, secular Jewish, liberal to, well, I'd say socialist household. And I had an older sister who was very influential. My family was pretty involved in politics, progressive, what we would call today progressive politics. My sister, who was 5 years older than me, was very active in the early days of SDS, and she was pretty in Students for Democratic Society, which was a major anti-war and progressive organization, student organization in those days. Became increasingly radical as the years went on. So I was very much a child of the 60s, and that was a big influence in the development of my politics and my commitment to social change. I attended high school in Teaneck, New Jersey. I was a very poor student. I hated school. I went to Goddard College, which was when I was first introduced to Vermont. I got a master's degree. I got a PhD at the New School for Social Research in cultural anthropology, and I came back to Vermont and taught at Goddard College for 32 years. I co-founded the Institute for Social Ecology with Murray Bookchin in 1974. Social ecology, I never really had a traditional career in anthropology. Social ecology was always sort of the lens that I used in my work. I've published a collection of essays, a number of articles. I've 2 novels that have been published. I'm sort of semi-retired now, though I'm still active on the board of the Institute for Social Ecology, which still exists today. And, that sort of sums up my career as it was. It was pretty unconventional. It was more of a way that I could pursue my passion than it was a vehicle for work. I was very lucky in that sense. I was able to work with a lot of very talented people and remain involved through my work in a variety of social movements, ecological movements, revolutionary movements. And I feel very lucky for that. Well, I became active. As I said, I was heavily influenced by both my parents and my older sister, and I became active myself as a teenager in high school. It was a period of the Vietnam War. I helped form a youth peace council, and we were involved in a number of demonstrations. And when I went to college, there was an active SDS chapter, and I became involved with them. I'd say at that point, I was fairly uninformed and not particularly sophisticated. I probably considered myself some kind of a Marxist. And in SDS, there was a lot of tumult. The period when I was involved in SDS, which I mentioned earlier, they had 300 chapters, over 300,000 members all around the country, and were really active in the civil rights movement and particularly in the anti-war movement. And SDS split, and the Weatherman faction took over, and they believed they had a Maoist, a Leninist approach to social change, that we had to create cadre and go underground and begin an underground war against the system, which would consist of assassinations and bombings and things of that sort. And, I was a kid at the time. I was like 18, 19 years old, and that was, of course, and our chapter overwhelmingly went with the Weatherman faction. So that's where I ended up politically, too. And I became very disillusioned with that approach. It proved to be pretty disastrous. I had a lot of friends who were forced to go underground, and a lot of people who did things that they later regretted. There was actually no lives lost in those campaigns after the first bomb factory exploded and killed 3 of our comrades. So the idea of taking human life was pretty quickly abandoned. But there were, literally over 100 attacks on property that was related to the war machine. And anyway, it was the practice was supposed to be supposedly democratic centralism. It's a classic sort of Marxist top-down approach to organizing. And I became very disillusioned with that. I was exposed. I had actually heard of Murray Bookchin earlier in the 60s, but I dismissed him. He was an anarchist. He was an ecologist. Ecology, that was just a bunch of bourgeois crap. So anyway, after my disillusionment with Weatherman, I began to read some anarchist literature, or just initially early stuff like Emma Goldman's autobiography. And I realized that I'd probably been an anarchist all along. I just was not really aware of that tradition. So that was very intriguing for me, and I began to, read more seriously and found various kinds of expressions of anarchism, and there wasn't a whole lot at that point, and was particularly drawn to the work of Murray Bookchin. I discovered when I was doing my master's work that he had moved to Burlington, Vermont, and I contacted him, and we began to work together at that point, and then we co-founded the Institute, and that was over 50 years ago. Murray died about 15 years ago, but he was really my mentor and the person who exposed me to anarchism. And I think increasingly as we collaborated, we also both came to see that the classic anarchist approach, while it had a lot to offer, also had some very severe limitations. And Bookchin, of course, became very upset with the turn to sort of lifestyle anarchism. He was always calling for political action, social action. And he also developed this approach that he calls libertarian municipalism, which is the basis for the whole Rojava revolution, in which I'm sure you're aware that the Kurds in northern Syria, who have created an ecological, feminist, directly democratic revolution. So anyway, it was rather than a clean break with anarchism, I'd say just sort of a gradual drift away. Classical anarchism, of course, insists that elections are useless. I believe in elections, not in the traditional sense, not what we have today, but I live in Vermont, and here we have a over 200-year-old tradition of town meeting, which is a directly democratic form of decision-making. So I believe in that. I believe in electoral politics at the local level, decentralized and then confederated to allow for coordination on an increasingly large level, regional, watershed-based, I don't know, however you want to define it, ultimately linked into, of course, a worldwide global confederation. At any rate, yeah, so that's sort of my political journey. Once again, in a nutshell, lots of stories I could tell. But through my involvement with social ecology, we have been involved really in every radical ecology movement that's occurred from the early 70s on, the early anti-nuclear movement, the Clamshell Alliance, the anti-globalization protests in Seattle, Occupy Wall Street. Ecofeminism was a term that was first coined at the Institute for Social Ecology by Nesta King. So as I said, there's a lot that could be said, but that's sort of a summary. It's a interdisciplinary perspective that draws on academic disciplines like philosophy and anthropology, history, ecological science. And it's a philosophical outlook that evolved coming really, well, there are a lot of different disciplines within the academy that call themselves social ecology or cultural ecology, but this particular outlook is one that was largely developed starting in the 1950s by Murray Bookchin. It draws on aspects of Marxism, aspects of anarchism, and it's a praxis, or it attempts to be a praxis, at least a theory that can be applied in the real world and then revised in relation to the outcomes. So it's a kind of a dialectical approach to social change, and we try to, the Institute, at least as a vehicle for social ecology, tries to provide people with a set of philosophical, intellectual tools that they can use to help them analyze the world and find ways that we can begin to change it. It has sort of three basic philosophical components. There's an epistemology, which is a definition of terms. What do we mean by the word nature? Seems pretty basic, but social ecology has a particular take on that. And our understanding of nature is provides us with a set of ethical guidelines. So there's a component that deals with ethics in a classic philosophical sense, and there's a politics that derives from that ethics. And it's a politics of direct democracy. It's not purely anarchist. I don't consider myself an anarchist, though at one point when I was younger I did. It's, we see politics not as the realm of statecraft, but as the way people come together through directly democratic processes to make the decisions that will affect their lives. So it's a rather comprehensive set of ideas, and it's very committed to the ideas of non-hierarchical institutions as a basis for our social life and participatory democratic forms of decision-making. And I could go on and on. I taught this stuff for 32 years in a formal setting and continue in that vein. So, but in a nutshell, I'd say that's what social ecology is. Represents a set of ideas and a way of acting in the world that we believe can bring about ecologically oriented social change. The ultimate goal of social ecology, of course, is the creation of an ecological society. And in that sense, it's quite utopian, but it's utopian in a positive sense. It has a vision for the future in which humanity and nature are reharmonized, in which humanity becomes nature rendered self-conscious, really, to use fictitious terms. So, yeah, in a nutshell, that's social ecology. I'd say I'm a libertarian socialist. That's probably the closest, or a council communist. There's a quote I like from Daniel Guerin. He said that anarchism has a broad back like paper. It can hold anything. It can contain anything. And there's such a broad, a sweeping scope of ways that people have used the term. As I said, my politics is defined by a belief in decentralization, direct democracy, and confederation. So that's the essence to me of, it's not anarchism, because anarchism doesn't believe in voting. Anarchists scorn any form, at least some definitions of anarchism, scorn any form of organization, any form of coordination, anything, because they feel it's all coercive. I think society depends on coordination, but I think there are mechanisms that we can use that allow us to ensure that that coordination is something in which we all have a say. That would be my ideal. So you could call me an anarchist, I guess, in that sense, if that's how we're defining it. The ideas, simply by their existence, have an importance and a power. Without ideas, uh, we're we're damned to just repeat what we've been doing, and we know that that's not working. So we are desperately in need of alternatives, and we're desperately in need of change. And the sources for change have almost always been from the margins. And I have seen over my over 50 years of active engagement with the ideas of social ecology that these ideas have already moved from being held by a tiny handful of people to millions and millions of people literally around the world. There are 45 million Kurdish people who are inspired by the Rojava Revolution, and something like 10 million actively involved at this point. So we know that those transformations can occur, but without the ideas that can help spark them and help inspire them, we have no future to speak of. And if I didn't believe that, I would have put a gun to my head a long time ago. But I've seen it. I've seen these ideas capture people all over the world, and I see that they resonate with ancient traditions that various indigenous people can relate to. I see that they are shared by people who have a sense of the immense potential that we have that lies ahead. And without the ideas, there really is no hope. I'm not suggesting that there are any guarantees either. My personal view is growing increasingly pessimistic at this point, given what's going on in the world. But there has to be resistance, and that resistance has to be informed by a set of ideas. So why don't we aim for our highest aspirations and see where we can end up? I think it depends on the particular place where people are, because I believe meaningful political action has to begin where you live, and that we need to begin to create alternatives. For me, there's really a three-pronged strategy for the kind of change I envision. We have to continue to protest. We have to use whatever means we have possible to prevent the current destruction from spreading, from getting worse. We absolutely must do that. It's a necessity, but it's not sufficient. At the same time, we have to create alternatives. At the Institute for Social Ecology, one of the things that we did beginning in the early 1970s was to work with models of what we called then alternative technologies, but ecological technologies. So we need to develop solar, wind power, various ways that we can maintain a certain degree of our civilization without destroying the planet. And at the same time, we have to create alternative economic forms. We have to create new cooperative forms of economics. We have to find a solidarity economy that understands that we have the capacity, we have for many years, to meet the material needs of the entire world's population. And it's really a question of creating new forms of production and distribution that can allow us to do that. The incredible concentrations of wealth that we see today are unprecedented. And it's just not right. Let's face it, we have 10 people in the US who have a wealth that's equal to the poorest 50%. So anyway, we need to create alternatives, and I don't just mean economic alternatives. We also have to create neighborhood assemblies, town councils, town meetings, and begin to create real meaningful forums in which people can discuss their problems and find solutions. And we have to confederate them, and that leads me to the third element, because it's necessary but not sufficient. Once again, to create alternatives, then we have to engage in politics. And by politics, I mean take these new forms of assembly and decision-making that we've created and use them to contest with the power of the state. And there are all kinds of ways we can do that. Direct actions, various nonviolent forms of disobedience, very effective ways that we've seen tremendous social change occur all around the world. So we need to find ways that we can develop those ourselves. I'm not a techno-optimist. I'm very skeptical about technology, but I do think that it has a role, and we're going to have to deploy it. We're going to have to deploy it to get ourselves out of this mess. But that's not going to do it alone. Social ecology tries to peel away the layers of the onion, or to mix metaphors, get to the root of the problem. And, we see that particular ecological problems and issues, and climate change is certainly of a magnitude that we haven't ever seen before. When we really analyze them, we see that ultimately their root lies in society. There's no such thing as an ecological problem. The problem is society. So we've got to fix society if we're going to really address these climate problems. And I think if we look at the direction that society is going, despite new technologies, you have to be incredibly naive to maintain any kind of techno-optimism. As long as that technology is going to be controlled by the likes of Donald Trump and by the corporations that control it today, we're going to see very little progress. We're going to see a continued regression of our climate. So people need to come to that realization. How do we get them there? I'm a firm believer in education, but I think education can take many forms. And, some people will get the idea because they read a book, or they hear a speaker, or they see something on the internet. Other people are going to have to find ways that they can participate at other levels. And we need to provide those opportunities for people. We need to continue to educate in every way we can.